Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Tokshkai Inside Look podcast, where I share inspiring stories of budoka around the world. Please share your favorite episodes with your dojo and community so this effort can be spread to more corners of the earth. This episode is brought to you by our amazing patrons over at Patreon. By donating as little as a cup of coffee to a bowl of ramen, they've directly made this podcast possible. If you're enjoying this work and can spare a small tip each month, it would mean a lot to me. I'll also be sharing the occasional behind-the-scenes clips and side initiatives that build on this podcast. You can find it at www.patreon.com/Tokshkai Canada. Thanks in advance for your support. And now, on to the interview.
Okay, so after the lecture we had on bird respiration, so we can continue on our series is how do other species do it. And because Dom and I work with amphibians, I thought that, well, maybe let's do amphibian respiration. So I had to brush up a little bit on how those guys do it, and I fell in love all over again with amphibians because they're really kind of cool. So let's explore this. So something we always have to keep in the back of our mind when we explore other things, we always have this idea of what's the most efficient, so you're going to see that amphibian is not necessarily the most efficient in terms of extracting oxygen and removing carbon dioxide from their blood. But we also have to keep in mind is that they are heterotherms. We are homeotherms, they are heterotherm. What does that mean? That means that we need to keep our body temperature constant at 30 degrees Celsius, right? Those guys, and that costs energy, right? We have to burn fuel to create this heat to keep that energy on, or sweat, which also costs energy. So we are glutton for energy, which means we are glutton for oxygen, right? But those guys, they are like, go with the flow. They don't have to produce their own heat. Their body works no matter what. Some species, when they live in winter in freezing environments, they just freeze with the water and then start again. And that's another beautiful thing to study, but that's besides the point. So yes, you may realize that they don't have an efficient system, but they don't need to. They just need to be efficient enough to that it covers their needs. And you're going to see what they really have for them is they have multiple ways of extracting oxygen from their environment, and that's really, really neat. So something to also realize is a huge diversity of amphibian in the world, right? We have amphibians with tails, we have amphibians without tails. Those are the frog and the toads we know and love. And they start as, fertilized eggs like we do. Most of them, but not all, most of them will undergo the larvae stage, which is water-based, right? Which means they have to get the oxygen from the water. And again, the majority of them will undergo metamorphosis, where they're going to acquire legs and also acquire lungs, right? So all the species here undergo metamorphosis, and in some cases that result a passage from water to land. So they become terrestrial, or they can live on the ground, all right? There's a few exceptions, like those guys we work with, Xenopus, they live in water, but they do breathe air, so they do have lungs. And we have exceptions, right? So for example, those guys here, axolotls, they grow legs, but they never get rid of their gills, which allow them to extract oxygen from the water. They can be metamorphosed, but in that case, they acquire lungs and they can live on the ground. But and then we have the oddballs. I love those guys, the lungless salamanders. There's a whole series of those across the world. Those don't have lungs, they don't have gills, which means they have to breathe via different means, which we're going to cover today. All right, so by and large, this introduction is to show you that those guys have 3 ways to extract oxygen. They can have all 3 of them, but most notably, they have 2 out of the 3. The lungs, right? just like we do. They extract oxygen from the lung and they remove carbon dioxide from the same organ. But they do a fair bit of that exchange through the skin. The skin is a major respiratory organ in all amphibians. All right. The difference is how much of the skin breathing contribute to the overall gaseous exchange you see in animals. And then there is the gill extraction, which is very similar to what the fish do. So I didn't expand on that because I think there's plenty of exploration to do with those two things here. And we can always recover that again if we ever have somebody to talk about fish. Okay. All right, airway breathing. So I'm going to switch from lung breathing to airway breathing because, again, frogs have a catch. It's not only about the lungs. There's other part of the airway that contribute to the gaseous exchange. And this other part is the mouth. So the mouth is very important for gas exchange. So in this little diagram here, you see all the exchange that those frogs are capable of doing. We're going to cover the skin a little bit later. Right now, I want to focus on what's happening here. So they do breathe just like we do. They inhale air through the nostril. The air goes down into the lungs. Exchange goes there. But a fair bit of that also happen in the mouth cavity. And why is this important has to do with the way their chest and abdomen is built, because they do not have the same anatomy as we do. It's quite a bit different. So there's just like we have a separation between the airway and esophagus with the lungs through this, I call that a sphincter. It's not really a sphincter, but it acts like one, called the glottis. So they can control to close or open the glottis as will, which will lock in the air in the lungs or not. All right, so let's start with buccal respiration. So look at that frog here. You've probably seen that before. So you see that the underneath of the mouth is going up and down, up and down. And I know it's a short movie, but even if you were doing it a little bit longer, maybe another 15 seconds or so, you would not see a chest expansion, right? So right now that frog is doing only the buccal respiration. It's move air that it took through its nostril, or not, they're closed, but that took through its nostril, and the air stays in the mouth, the buccal cavity, and exchange of gas will happen there, okay? Just by free diffusion, the carbon dioxide from the blood, the mouth is reaching blood vessel. So the carbon dioxide will go into the buccal cavity and will pick up the load of oxygen that is in the buccal cavity. So one of the reasons why it does this movement with the throat, it's to move the air around, right? If you keep a fluid still, you're going to have the diffusion will not occur as easily because fluids tend to stick to the surfaces, the hard surfaces it's around. It's a physics concept that I am going to botch for sure. So moving allow the brassing of the air in there and make sure the extraction happen at top capacity.
That's like what we were talking about last week about moving orthogonal, like the blood and the air in the birds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that speeds up the process for sure. It's a little bit different, although there is part of that in the bird with a counter exchange of the blood going one way and the air going the other way. But yeah, that's in a sense that's what's happening here and why it's being done this way. You're correct. All right. So the way buccal respiration occurs. So first you need to close the glottis here that prevents the air going into the lungs. And the frog will breathe in some air and it's going to be moved around with this movement of the throat. So that means that the muscle, one of the major respiratory muscles in those frogs, are going to muscle that contribute to the movement of the double chin here. Okay, and specifically those two muscles here, the sternohyal and whatever, they're muscles we don't have. Actually, we do have them, but they are linked differently, so they don't have the same names. Okay, so that brings about, what about the lungs? Do they do any lung breathing? Yes, they do, but they do that on top of the buccal breathing. So for the buccal, for the what I call pulmonary respiration, the lung respiration, so the sequence of events, it's pretty much like we've seen in mammals and in birds. You breathe in air into the buccal cavity, the sphincter, the glottis opens, so now the air goes all the way into the lungs. And it's going to stay here for a little while. They don't need to have those breaths, those full breath, I'm going to call it that, as often as we do. And one of the reasons why is because they don't have the requirement of oxygen than we do, but also because they do a fair bit of buccal respiration. And when they're done, this air is going to be pushed out of the frog through the same way. So they have very similar respiration as we do. It's called a non-tidal respiration. We've seen the tidal respiration with birds. They don't have air sac, they don't have any of this. Whatever comes in, comes out through the same passageway. So the thing that is going to be a bit different here is in humans.
Sorry, just to clarify that last point. Yeah. For humans, it's tidal.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
And then birds is
the other way around. Yes. I'm sorry about that. So we are tidal, frogs are tidal, and the birds are non-tidal. They have a continuous flow. Sorry about that. Thank you. Yeah. So what comes in comes out through the same airway for those guys, just like humans. The difference is what muscles are used to bring in this air into the lungs. So as we know by now, the lungs are not a muscular organ. They don't inflate and deflate on their own. They're really just balloons. And to get air in, you need to create pressure, okay? Negative pressure, a positive pressure. So what happens in humans is the diaphragm lowers, your intercostals become bigger, and that's going to expand the rib cage and therefore increasing the volume inside the lung, and you're going to create a negative pressure that's going to come in. Negative pressure, yeah. Going to create a pressure that's going to come in, allow the air to reach the lungs. So it's the same principle with frogs. They also have non-muscular lungs, but they don't have the same muscles we do. Oops, I forgot I had that one. So just a reminder, diaphragm, the intercostals here that allow this chest cavity to increase or decrease in size. So in inhaling, you depress the diaphragm by contraction. You contract also the intercostal, which will increase the distance between the rib and overall increasing the rib cage. And during exhale, the diaphragm relaxes, the intercostal also relaxes, and then naturally the chest will shrink and therefore expel passively the air through the nose and the mouth. So that's a negative pressure system. And so what about frogs? So the problem of frogs is they don't have a diaphragm. They don't have ribs. So if they don't have ribs, they don't have intercostals to do that, right? So here I color-coded the things. The sternum that we do, they do have a sternum, but it's not linked to any ribs in that particular frog. For some frogs, you have maybe one rib. That's pretty much it. So you still don't have intercostal. So yeah, you don't see any ribs. There's no yellow here. So how do they inflate and deflate the lungs? Well, they're going to use other muscles. One of them is actually, remember this buccal respiration, right? They swallow air through those two muscles I mentioned earlier that you can't pronounce. That's going to be part of that, right? So they use this buccal muscles, and they are going to use their abdomen and chest as well, but it's mostly the abdomen. When you see them breathe, and I have a movie coming up soon, a movie you're going to see the whole abdomen shrinking, and they contract the abdominal muscles, and that put pressure on the lungs. Those lungs go all the way down to where the gut is, right? There's no separation between the thorax and the abdomen because, again, there is no diaphragm. So by contracting the abdominal muscle, they're crushing the lungs, and that push the air out. So the mechanics is a little bit different from our own. The last thing also that's different between long breathing between mammals and frogs is the way the lung is built. So the lung in frog is very basic, very simple. Imagine a hollow tube, right? You have a tube, a hollow tube, and then on the side of the tube you grow some like half étagère. I forgot my English now for some reason. It's stuck there. Little shelves that actually increase the exchange surface for gas, right? So it's a very basic system. So here you have a cross section of our frogs, Cynicis frog, and so you see it's completely hollow at the center, and you have some outpocketing on the outside here, and here you have a longitudinal section. Strangely enough, they also have some cartilages embedded in there, probably to prevent the lung from completely collapsing during the exhale. And in human, it's a bit different strategy. So the way I like to think about this, like think of a frog lung as a carrot, right? This is like long but it's hollow inside. In the case of human or mouse or any mammals, it's more like a tree, right? So you have the trunk, the branches, and at the end of the thinnest branches, you have the leaves, right? And the leaves, this is where things happen. Here in our case, we call them alveoli. This is where the gaseous exchange occurs, right? So at first glance, you wouldn't think that this one is much better than this one in terms of air exchange, but actually there's millions of those tiny alveoli in the lungs, which means that they have a much greater exchange surface in the lungs of mammals than you have in frogs. I mean, they're capable of extracting more oxygen. Again, they have the lungs they need because we are homeotherms. So we burn lots of energy and need lots of oxygen just to maintain our temperature. And the last thing also that's different is, so this is a cross section through an alveoli here. You have another alveoli there, another alveoli here. And in between, the tissue is so thin that it looks like you just have blood, red blood cells. And you see here, those little red dots here, those are red blood cells. It appears that the alveoli are made of air and red blood cells. There is some tissue in here, but it's very, very, very thin. So it's so thin that you have a very hard time seeing it here. And you see the nucleus of some of those like texture cells in there. So what does that mean? That means that the air doesn't have to cross a whole lot of tissue to reach the blood and the red blood cells. So the diffusion here is very efficient just by the sheer structure of those alveoli. This is a cross section. This is a pink one. So it's a section through here. Already you notice what I call the connective tissue, what makes up the lung tissue, is much thicker in frogs, which means that the air that is here has to cross a whole bunch more tissue than you would in humans. So this exchange of air, of gas between the air here and the blood vessel there is going to be not as efficient, or I should say, it's going to take more time, right? But the blood flow still keeps going on, so you don't change that much. So those are the differences, but it's more at the physiology level. But again, it suits the frog well, right? So moving on. All right, so this is actually a GIF. So I put the link for that. I just love it. So I'm just going to share, play it. Right, so I think we all know the frogs for their mating habits. So the males have those extra sac either at the front or on each side, depending on the frog, of their buccal cavity. And they use the sac for two things. First, to put more air pressure and make those really awesome sound or very annoying sounds, depending. The people are going to wake up at some point, so we'll know soon how annoying that can be. But they also can be color. So that's a mating thing, like look how loud I am, how gorgeous I am, colorful I am. So this is also a trait of that, but that is possible only because all this is interlinked with the respiratory system, okay? So I like the GIF because you can actually stop them frame by frame. So I was able to deconstruct visually what happened. So I encourage you to not take my words as is, but look at those frame by frame. And this is what I saw. First, the air comes into the lungs, right? You see those nostrils come opening and closing. And then the air get pushed into the side by the larynx. You're gonna see the abdominal cavity shrinks. So they're using the same muscle they do to expel the air from the lungs from the outside. But in that case, they keep the nostril closed. So when they push on the abdominal muscle to expel their air from the lungs, it doesn't go outside, it goes into the buccal cavity and pushes air into those vocal sacs, right? And eventually, and the thing that I was not expecting is that air does not get released outside just right away. It goes back into the lungs and then it gets exhaled. And that I did not expect, but sometimes slow-mo is the best way to figure out what sequence of events is going on here. So it's pretty cool.
So are you saying like the air goes into the lungs, comes out, and then goes back in, the same batch of air?
Yeah. So, which means it's very, it hasn't been studied as far as I could search. They don't contribute to the gas exchange. It's really 100% only to make noise and to flash those colors at the ladies. That's all this is to it. All right, and I could not help myself, so I put that in there, right? So like I said, there's different type of vocal sacs. Those here have to be my favorite. So two little sacs on each side, just like the Indian bullfrog we just saw. Most of them is just one big sac, and sometimes they're so big that they're taking the entire buccal cavity, so it looks like it's just expanding in one big blow. But it's just super funny. Some are super big, some are colorful, some are both. It's kind of fun. Anyway, so that brings about to what can we take from this? Well, actually, that's been done already. And maybe there's something you talked about before we join in with Dom. This frog breathing, this buccal breathing, it's actually used by divers to force more air into the lungs. And what they do is they use the equivalence of the same muscles, and then some more. It's not only those guys, but the equivalent of the muscle of the frog that the frog uses to do this buccal movement. And then that's at a starter, and then they swallow, if you will. I'm not sure how they do that. I need to look at the paper. I found the paper and I need the time to actually look at it. They swallow that air and force them into the lungs. So that means they can actually force push more air technically into the lung as they would with a normal deep breathing. Actually, that's the theory of it. I'm not convinced yet, so I need to look at the research on this one, but this is what appears to be doing. So they really uses this frog breathing to help them. More interesting, what I didn't know, I thought it was super cool. This technique has also been used in the past by polio survivor, to breathe during emergency situations. So this virus, polio viruses, attack the nerves and render parts of your body paralyzed, right? If that happens for your diaphragm, because the diaphragm is a muscle, then you can't breathe. So the iron lungs is trying to compensate for this lack of diaphragmatic respiration. But in case of emergency, there was a way for those patients to survive until they got brought back into an iron lung chamber, and they used that technique. And that I didn't know. I thought it was super cool. And that can also come in handy for other diseases that involve paralysis, like Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We can teach, as some people that teach those children how to do that type of breathing in situation where they have trouble breathing. So I thought it was pretty cool. So we're using that already. And that covers the part about what I call the airway breathing, which is both buccal and lung breathing. You have any question?
I have one. When you said that the air goes into the lungs, comes out into the sacs, go back in, it like when you say that that's not involved, that's not part of respiration. Doesn't respiration just happen naturally whenever air is close to whatever the transfer parts are?
Yeah.
So
no, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. What I meant to say is it didn't bring anything extra to the gas exchange, because this is air that is already being in the buccal cavity. So it's air that's already being used for gas exchange. And if it's not the air in the buccal cavity, it was in the lung. So it doesn't bring anything extra to the respiratory system. It's just plugging into the respiratory system for sexual displays. That's what I meant there.
Okay, so it's not like with cows with multiple stomachs, it actually helps with the extra digestion. In this case, yeah, it's not used for extra breathing.
Yeah. Exactly. So it doesn't cost anything. It doesn't bring anything extra. Yeah. As far as I know, we're still doing research on frogs, and one day somebody will realize actually it does contribute something. And but as far as I could tell, it does not.
I've got a few questions.
Yeah.
Do amphibians have the same issue as lizards, in which they cannot breathe and move at the same time? I think that's a thing. Like the same muscles that they use to get air into the lungs are the same ones that they use to move. Is that similar, or am I just remembering something very differently?
Yeah, so I'm not super knowledgeable in lizards, so I wouldn't know this. But in terms of the frogs, so frogs use mostly their legs for locomotion, right? And so the legs are not plugged into. They don't need the legs to expel and expand their chest and abdominal cavity. So this is kind of decoupled a little bit. So now I haven't made movies of my frogs seeing if they stop breathing while they move. So I can't tell you for sure if what I'm trying to say is right or not, but I don't think I think they can breathe and move just well enough because they don't use the same muscles.
Yeah, even because they're amphibious, they can still move. They don't have to actually, push air into their lungs. They can just absorb it if they need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And the second part of the skin breathing is that even if they don't use their airways, they can still breathe through their skin. So so it's kind of hard to figure this one out, but they do get exchanged no matter what. So yeah.
And I'm trying to think that there are a few other. I think lizards they have sexual displays on there. They blow their, I don't know what they call it. It's on the neck that it frills up. I mean that.
Yeah.
Has there been any kind of study on why breathing is such a aphrodisiac or a sexual display in a lot of these species?
I'm not sure. So again, I don't know reptile all that well. I'm not sure in the case of the frilled lizard, it's coupled to breathing. I thought there was a different muscle that they just have to contract and relax to open and close that flap.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It looks like it's around their throat. So
Yeah, it's different around the throat, but it's just like this cartilaginous. So it's like a disc. It just happened that the skin around that disc of whatever it is colorful. So it's just showing it or and closing it and heading it. But I don't think it's not a pocket of air. I don't think so. I'll double check. Like I said, I'm not on it double. Yeah, I don't think so, but I could be wrong. So I can look it up for you. All right. So if there's no more question, let's move on to the skin breathing. I'm very jealous because I wish we had that too. So I'll put this one first. Okay, doesn't matter. I should start with that one. Amphibian can and do a huge amount of breathing through the skin. Right, so the gas exchange. And they can do that, and we can't, for two main reasons. Why can't we do this is because our skin is waterproofed, right? We have a very thick, we would drop a drop of water in our skin is going to trail and fall off. It's because we have a keratin layer. Keratin layer is actually the skeleton of dead cells that piled up onto one another to form this barrier of pure keratin. Keratin is actually a protein that's making the skeleton of the cells. And it's waterproof when you put them into thick enough layers, right? So that's great because that means we can walk outside and not get dehydrated. But that means we lost what fish and frog can do naturally, which is breathing through the skin. So fish and frogs are locked into body of water. They need to live near bodies of water, only if they don't need to develop strategy to not get dehydrated, because they don't have, or they have very little keratin layer on the skin, right? So that means they lose their water pretty easily through the skin. That also means they can do gas exchange through their skin, which is really, really cool. And a second adaptation they have is actually they have lots of blood vessels, more so than we do apparently, that I didn't know. Lots of blood vessel that just runs right under the skin. So that means they can do this exchange, again, passively through the skin. And that can happen whether the amphibian lives in water or lives on land, which is really, really neat. And the good news is, as you probably know, water temperature affects how much oxygen goes in there. So the colder the water, the more, so the colder the water in blue here, the more oxygen you can get in there. Okay, so that they can go in pretty far remote places that are very cold. Actually, the coldest, the better. But another thing that affects how much oxygen goes into the water are, how much current there is. Either you live in a stream or you live in a pond, that really affects the thing. The more currents you have, the more oxygen can brush onto your skin, and therefore more exchange of gas you can do. And also the pressure of the water. The deeper you go, the more gas exchange could technically happen, but I'm not really sold on the physics of that. All right, so which species, the species that really just do everything through the skin, they don't need anything else? Well, the longless lizard we talked about earlier. So here's in the axis, you have the percentage of gas exchange. In orange, it's the oxygen coming in, and on green is the carbon dioxide coming out. And longless salamander does 100% of that exchange through the skin. They don't have lungs, right? But that brings about, if you did do any buccal breathing, that I don't know, that would be very interesting to look at. Hellbender, those big fat salamanders, we do have some actually in the US. They also pretty much do everything through the skin, only because they live in cold water, running water. So there's plenty of oxygen dissolved in it. So they don't really need to do a whole lot of lung breathing, although they do have lungs. And tadpoles, that's, like I said earlier, all the vast majority, I should say, of amphibians go through the tadpole stage. So it's pretty much like a fish. And they do a lot of that exchange also through the skin, also not completely up, only to 70% of carbon dioxide gets removed there. It's because they have gills. So whatever is not done through the skin, it's done through the gills. But if nothing else, it tells you how important the skin of amphibians are. So if you are a herpetologist and keep frogs, you know that they are tolerant of a lot of things, but they're not tolerant of chemicals that can affect their skins because that will affect their respiration. So you have to be careful with that. All right. So for those species that live in standing water, like our ugly frog, the Xenopus, so standing water has a hard time you know, it doesn't exchange their oxygen and other gaseous compounds as easily with the air, right? The reason why we have dissolved O2 in the water is because we have O2 in the air, right? So the O2 of the water that is used for breathing underwater is actually come from the air. So if the air doesn't move so much, you're gonna have issues with exchanging the oxygen of the air with whatever gas is dissolved in the water. So moving things really help gaseous exchange. And that's true for water and air. It also is going to be true for the frog in the water. If the frog lives in an environment that is not so rich in oxygen, so it's going to have some, this is the only picture I could find of this boundary layer thing. So it's a wing airplane, but it's basically the same thing. Imagine that the wing is the frog. This is on blue, this is where the oxygen is, the rich oxygen. If the frog doesn't change, doesn't move, it's going to create a banner layer of water that has gas that is very similar to what it has inside. And if it needs oxygen, that's not going to do. So if you raise your frog in standing water, you might see your frog moving around to break that boundary layer and expose their skin to fresher water with more oxygen. All right. So apparently that little lungless salamander lives in the Appalachian. So now that I want to go there, try to find them. They're super beautiful, right? So those guys, so that's a funny thing. They don't have lungs. They can only breathe through the skin. You would think they would be aquatic, and they're not. They are living on land, right? So so like I said, they can actually exchange oxygen through the skin via the air. It's not a problem. Actually, there's more oxygen in the air than there is dissolved in the water. But you see that most of those lungless salamanders will be small, right? The fact they can only extract oxygen through the skin means they are limited in how big they can grow. That is very reminiscent of, I don't know if you know the story of how insects used to be on Earth when the amount of oxygen on Earth was much higher than it was today. Insects could grow bigger for the same reason. So the amount of oxygen they can get really limit how big they can get. All right, and they also tend to live in cold environments. So you'll find them in Europe, you'll find them in North America. You have a few tropical species. So again, the colder, the more oxygen goes freely is in there. So it's always decided cold is rich in oxygen and hot is not so much. Those few species that lives in the tropics have only gets out at night and when it's raining to compensate for the fact that they live in warmer climates. All right, so to finish this, I have 3 tricks that frogs have developed to adapt to the environments. The amphibian really went on all continents but Antarctica. And some environments are rich in oxygen, some are poor in oxygen. So I love that frog. This is the Titicaca Lake frog. So Lake Titicaca in South America is very high in altitude. Okay, so high in altitude means the oxygen in the air is lower than at sea level. which means that the oxygen of the lake is also lower than sea level. And on top of that, those guys, they don't live near the surface, they live deep underwater, and they almost never come up, right? They stay deep in the lake. So it's very, very, very strange. So that means they live in an environment that is depleted in oxygen. No matter, they develop extra skin, and so they look like Sharpies. And the extra skin to increase the surface area for gas exchange, and therefore making sure they can absorb the proper amount of oxygen they need. I love those guys.
So a question.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be also because if they ever get to the surface, they would just blow up if they didn't have extra skin? Because they would be compressed, okay? So basically, if they were at lower compression, the gas inside would increase in size, and they need extra skin to compensate for that, no?
Yeah, so I see what I mean. Yes, so that's the scuba diver dilemma, right? When they dive super low, they get more gas dissolving into their blood, and if they come up too fast, they can develop the bands or anything. That's what you were getting at.
If you take a balloon down at the bottom, it's going to be a tiny little ball, and if you bring it to the top, it's going to expand, and if it doesn't have room to expand, it will blow up. So if these frogs didn't have extra skin, if you ever take them to the surface, they would blow up.
So yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, so that's you're correct. That could be one thing, but those can actually go at the surface. They just choose not to. But this video here from the National Geographic actually follows one of those frogs in Lake Titicaca, and the frog is being bothered, so it goes near to the surface, it doesn't blow up. So I hear what you said. The more skin you have, the faster the gas exchange equilibrium can happen, and therefore you prevent the bends, which is basically what comes from air bubbles going too big too fast. But and they can use the lungs if you force them to. It's just not what they do in a natural habitat. The food is down there. They have all the skin they need to breathe. They have no impetus in going under the surface, but there's predator at the surface, so they don't want to go there. But they can and survive.
This one looks like it's in an aquarium.
I know. I want to have one or two. Those are big, by the way. They're really big frogs, so you need big aquariums.
So when you have frogs, you mentioned earlier that the bullfrog had like 60% of the carbon dioxide comes out of skin, but a huge amount of oxygen goes through the airway.
Yeah.
So in the case like this, like are they physiologically different? Or yeah, they're going different. So they, on that diagram, they don't have the whole different frogs, but I wish they had more species going out there, because there's obviously differences among those three very extreme ones, but there has to be some differences between the bullfrog and all those other frogs we know, like the Titicaca Lake frog, for example. I'm sure there's going to be differences in the way they eliminate that. They would be, I would be willing to bet that they would have an exchange system that's closer than that. Even though they have lungs, everything is done through the skin. That's my bet. Now we need to do the experiment. Yeah. So another example, the hellbenders. So hellbenders grow really, really large. And there's a version of hellbender in Japan, which is the largest amphibian in the world. And they all live also in the same places, cold, fast-moving water, right? And that what's the reason why they can grow so large is they have endless surplus of oxygen, and the velocity and the temperature of the water means that there's plenty of oxygen for them to extract through their skin. Plus, those guys also have a lung, so they can breathe as well. But again, those guys, they do have, if we go back to that diagram I just quit, the hellbenders, they are here. They do most of their oxygen extraction in a water environment through the skin. Those are super cool. And last, yeah, that last one, I thought it was pretty cool. It aligns with a evolutionary theory. No, number
Yeah.
two.
Yeah.
An evolutionary theory that says that human lungs came from fish air sacs, buoyancy sacs.
Yep.
So this is like that intermediate stage where you can use it for both.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the evolution of the lungs is just amazing. Yes, it's absolutely right. It's the using things that we don't use anymore because we don't need water, like the air sacs that is used for buoyancy in fish, and that got transformed into something useful like extracting oxygen from the air. Yeah, which allow them to develop the skin that we have, which is water and air impermeable. Yeah. And trick number 3, the last one. I love this one. So this frog has many, many tricks up its sleeve. One I never heard of, that my kiddo told me, that they're capable of actually breaking their bones and shooting them through the skin to detect predators. I don't know about that one, but I know that one because they have those, sorry, you see those like spiky hair looking thing? This is actually skin extensions. So it's a different way of doing what the Lake Titicaca frog does, except that those hair, what I call hair extension, they're not hair, but they're skin extension, can appear and disappear at will depending on the oxygen level on the environment. Right. So same thing. They can adapt. The weird thing is it happens, and that's to finish off on something really weird. It's only males apparently that do that, and during breeding season only. So that is, so herpetologists, they think that is because allow them to remain submerged longer while air guarding. So those are good feathers. Well, once the eggs are fertilized, the male keep them, and they lay in the water. And because the water has poor oxygen, the frog that has to stay and guard the eggs have to develop a way to extract more oxygen out of this water. So that's a theory out of that. I don't know where it's at, but I thought it was really, really cool. And as soon as the breeding season is over and the tadpole have hatched, those hair protuberance, their skin will resorb, and a frog become smooth again. So that's it for the skin. And like I said, there was a thing on gills, but I think they could be kept for the fish if we ever have a fish respiratory system lecture, to keep the format under an hour and maybe allow more time for discussion. So that's all I have for today.
All right. Thank you so much, Helene. Yeah, you weren't kidding when it says, like, just reminder, just going back at this. I think the last time I really was exposed to amphibians was in middle school when they just introduced them. But yeah, just remembering a few of these things. For one thing, the fact that they go through the stage of having gills and then building lungs, and it's the same creature, that's so amazing. Yeah, and some frogs, they completely curb the tadpole with gill stage. They go directly from egg to froglets. There's actually quite a few of those, and we keep discovering species like that. We're not done discovering the variety of amphibian world. So, and there's some that never metamorphose, but they still have legs. So axolotl was actually something that puzzled me. There's like axolotl that don't metamorphose, but they have legs. Like, wait a minute, normally when you metamorphose, you go from legless to with legs. So now I need to look it back, because like, there's a question I didn't ask when I was a student. I should have asked, and now I need to ask them now. I answer. So I'll keep digging at this, because it's weird. Yeah, and then like even just hearing that the human skin is not permeable. Yeah, like I just assume that skin by definition means it's a layer that blocks everything. Yeah, but in this case, like there are reasons why you want to allow certain. Either gas exchange or moisture. Yeah. So yeah, you need. There's really lots of advantages of making your skin waterproof. If nothing else, it prevents you from getting infected all the time. Right. It's really, really, this is our biggest immune system, is our skin.
And it's passive. It doesn't cost us anything, right? But we lost what our ancestors had, which is the ability to extract oxygen from it. So yeah, no, it's really cool. It's make you think about the evolution and the why and how, and it's really awesome. I love it.
Anyone else have questions? Yeah, Peter.
Speaking of evolution, is there, okay, so I came across these things where the more speciation there is, it seems like it's like an older clade. Like insects, like a bee will have 10,000 species of bee, and mammals, the whole clade of mammals is like 5,500.
Yep.
What about amphibians? Where do they lie in that?
So it's so you're absolutely correct. So in terms of vertebrates, so fish are vertebrates, those guys are vertebrates, we are vertebrates. The number of species is the most diverse in the older species, which is the fish. So fish have the widest diversity of all the vertebrates we know of. And that's why they are, if you're into the research into the genomics, they're trying to sequence as many fish genome as possible because it's so much older clad than any others. They want to see the diversity of the branching, what happened to the genes and stuff. And amphibians are right next to it, right? So the amphibians are the tetrapods. They arose before the dinosaur time, right? So the amphibians are older than dinosaurs. And so they are really close to the fish, is that they have lots and lots of different species, different strategy for adaptation, and therefore different genomes. And I'm really sad to see there's very few genomes of frogs being sequenced. We need to do a better job at that. And we're frog people, so what the heck? So yeah, there's huge diversity, less than the fish, but definitely a whole lot more than the birds or the mammals. And it's because it's an ancient clade that was there before, way before us. So yeah, you're correct.
Okay. Do you have a round number of how many amphibian
species there is? We can ask Google because I don't know, and I'm really bad with numbers, so you want to know. But yeah, and that's a number that keeps changing, I tell you, because they keep discovering new species. It's like every day, like, oh, two more species. I think there was an event a few months ago where they discovered an entire 20 species in one of the somewhere. I have a bad memory, so I can't remember, but I was like, oh Jesus, they keep discovering stuff. It's kind of right now with the amphibian world, we're in a race of discovering as many species as possible because they're dying off much faster than we discover them because of this fungal disease that is widespread now across the world. So this is one of the reasons why. So it's kind of sad because we're losing species for sure. So, yeah, thousands would be a good estimate. Maybe tens of thousands, but yeah, I can't tell you. I don't know.
Anyone else have any questions for today? Cool. Well, thank you again, Helene, for preparing this. Go into detail, getting some research. Next week, we're going to scrape off some skin and practice skin breathing.
Yep.
Okay, so we'll continue looking for other experts. Otherwise, we'll just continue meeting again and practicing different areas, because ultimately we're gaining knowledge on breathing, and hopefully some of it we can apply to our own practice. All right, thank you so much, and I'll see you guys in 45 minutes if you're coming to the. Thank you.
Bye.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode, because we have a lot more exciting conversations to share as we explore the world of the traditional Japanese martial arts. The Inside Look podcast is brought to you by our amazing patrons over at Patreon. If you are enjoying this work, please consider supporting me at patreon.com/Tokuskai Canada. To contribute to this effort, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at tokuskai.canada, or subscribe to our newsletter at subscribe@tokuskai.ca. Until next time, thanks for listening.